wreck, a risk in my neck, and a hell of a pilot too. A hell of a, hell of a, hell of a, hell of a, hell of a pilot too. Like all the jolly good flyers, the gremlins treat me mean. I'm a flying wreck, a risk in my neck for the good old 318. If I had a peachy, sir, I'd paint it blue and gold. I'd take it up 5,000 feet and make the darn thing roll. Oh, if I had a peachy, sir, I'd fly it off in the sky. I'd circle over Germany and spit in the Fuhrer's eye.
Somebody had to fly the planes at home. You couldn't just let them sit rusting on the ground.
Betty was one of the pioneer women who paid their own way to get to Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas.
Women's Air Force Service pilots.
They were called the WASPS. Their mission, fly military aircraft in the United States to free up men for combat flights.
When she was young, she was riding in the back of her parents' car, and they passed Teterboro Airport, and she stood up and said, it was before seatbelts, and said to her mom, I'm going to fly someday. And her dad said, girls don't fly. And her mother said, you can do anything you want. And when she decided she was going to apply to the WASPs, you had to have your pilot's license first in order to be admitted. And there were thousands that applied. And she got her pilot's license and applied and was accepted. She was a little bit short. I think you had to be 5'4", and she stretched as far as she could be to 5'3.5", but the doctor let her in anyway, and she sat on an extra parachute so that she could see to fly.
And only 6 months ago, we were green recruits arriving at Avenger Field, Texas. Soon we were hard at it, from 6 a.m. to sundown. We ranged in age from 21 to 35, where we studied engines, physics, codes, and map reading.
They had a civilian pilot training program to train people to be pilots, and the government started that. The program was at no charge, but they mandated 1 out of 10 of the applicants had to be females. So that's how my mother got started with her pilot training. She was, she lived with her mother, single mother, and they didn't have much. So it's not like she was wealthy and could afford to rent an airplane.
So the War Department and industrial leaders turned their attention to inviting women, pressuring women to take on some of these jobs.
The more than 18 million women who worked in our factories during the war. Women who, for the most part, had never worked outside their own homes. They filled the industrial gaps left by the men who had been mustered into the fighting forces. They performed with distinction numberless jobs requiring precise technical skills, and others that took just sweat and grit.
Those forms of women's labor that had previously prevented them from working in the industrial workforce, right, that women were only suited for doing jobs that were related to their domestic function, like teaching and nursing and seamstress work, those kinds of jobs. All of a sudden now their domestic experience qualified them to become welders and plane builders. And so that was a huge PR campaign that took place. Women really pushed the military to allow them to become part of the Army Corps, even though they were not allowed to bear arms, and of course the WASPs. Women did take an initiative to really demand that kind of work. And of course women were doing Red Cross work, they were nursing, they were not allowed to be in the front lines, but they were able to become part of the military force. The view of women serving in the armed forces was very, there was a lot of ambivalence around this, like would women remain in the armed forces, and do we really want that, and what kind of role should they play? But by 1948, women were integrated into the military with the Women's Armed Service Integration Act. So yes, they did take initiative and transformed the military.
I know of many stories where they would fly in and the men would be miserable to them and treat them like secondhand citizens because they didn't feel that women should be flying. When the WASPs went through training, the instructors, many of the instructors were terribly hard on them and asked them to fly different patterns and do things that certain planes were not supposed to do. And in one of my mom's tests, she was flying and the instructor told her to put it into a nosedive and a spin, and then you lose your engine, so you have to restart them. And she said, "No, sir, this plane is not supposed to do that." And he said, "I told you to do that." She said, "Yes, sir." And so she put it into a nosedive, and she said she couldn't get her engine started. She couldn't get it pulled out. And he said, "Give me the controls." And she said, "Absolutely not, sir. If I crash, you do too." She finally pulled it out, but they were terrible. A lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them were very, very hard on the women. One time when some of my mom's friends were bringing in one of the bombers that they used to call it the Widowmaker. None of the men wanted to fly it. So they took some WASPs up, and I think they had about a weekend of training to learn to fly it. And they radioed that they were coming in for a landing, and they got on and said, "Hey, lady, get off the radio. We're trying to bring in one of the bombers." She said, "Who the hell do you think is flying it?"
So lots of different forms of microaggression, and then the unions wouldn't necessarily come to the assistance of women who made complaints, so they were vulnerable in that way.
And they got washed out. They got so many demerits, and if they missed, then they'd go with an instructor, a different instructor, to see if they were satisfied with the progress they were making. And if they weren't, they were just washed out. You know, you'd come back to the barracks that night, and that person would just be gone. The Tuskegee Airmen, and I have all the respect in the world for them, they were much like the WASP. Back then, they weren't sure that blacks could fly or women could fly, and they proved that they could. They were just as good as anybody else. But there's been 2 movies done about the Tuskegee Airmen, and I've talked to the Tuskegee Airmen. They said until these movies came out, a lot of people never heard about us. So I'd really like to see a movie about the WASP. Of course, that's up to Hollywood. They got a salary. It was less than the men. I think the men were paid $350 a month, and the women were paid $200 a month to do the same thing. But they did have to pay a lot of their own expenses. They paid for their own uniforms. They paid for their own transportation to get there. They were given hand-me-down coveralls, and they were all too big. They were like large and extra large, so they were looking for rubber bands to roll the sleeves up and the pant legs up, which to me was dangerous. You get a sleeve caught on a control or the throttle, and you get stuck. You don't want to do that.
They didn't have any benefits. They got much less pay. They were not recognized as officers. They didn't even have military status. They were just civilians until the 70s.
It was the same program with the exception of combat. The men learned combat, the women did not. But other than that, they went through the same training. They initially started in Houston, and then they were moved to Sweetwater for training.
That was where the base was, where all the recruits went in and went through their basic training. And once they graduated, that's when they were sent out to other bases.
One nice thing, my understanding, they were able to use the airplanes on weekends to go. If they wanted to go visit a friend or something, that they'd encourage them to use the planes to get more practice and go somewhere.
I know my mom's one friend, Helen, towed targets for live ammunition practice out of Topsail. They did a lot of ferrying planes from one base to another. They did test piloting. I know they had quite an important part. They would tie a target onto the back of the plane, and women would go up and fly down the coast, and the men would shoot at them with live ammunition.
There were 37 accidents towing targets involving WASP. 14 of those occurred at Camp Davis. There were 3 deaths as well. they towed the targets along the beaches.
Mom said that they would take up collections to send the bodies home and to help the families pay for funeral arrangements.
You know, the town got together to raise money for the funeral of one of the WASP at Camp Davis.
They were not allowed a flag on their coffin, even when they died in a crash or an accident.
Wow.
And they did not get veterans benefits until the 1970s.
And that was kind of, to me, that was a travesty too. They really are doing this work for our country, and they were promised they were civilians, and when they came in, and they were going to be made military. Well, 30 years later, I mean, the men getting out of World War II had the VA benefits and the GI benefits. They could go to college and they could go to the hospitals, and all that was paid for. Well, the WASP didn't get any of that, not until 30 years later when they were made veterans. So by this point in life, they're probably not going to go to college like a lot of the men did. You know, the men got out of World War II, they were in their 20s, and let's go to college. And so the WASP got this 30 years later.
So when the war concluded, for many women who had been busy filling these industrial jobs, who were having opportunities that had never been open to them before, the consequences of the war's end was devastating.
The war was starting to wind down, and the men were coming back, and now they didn't need all these pilots, so the male pilots were pushing back. They were still in the military, but if they couldn't fly, they'd be in the infantry on the ground. And so they say, we don't need these WASPs. Let's push back. And so there was they went to Congress and said, look, this is the way it is. They shouldn't be doing this.
She was heartbroken. She, when they were all called out to the flight line, and Cochran was there, and she made the announcement that they were all being disbanded, and the women were all in tears. They didn't give them any money to get home. It was the responsibility of, if they had savings or their families, to send the money so that they could get back to wherever home was.
It was a shame. And when they were disbanded, there was no ceremony. They just found out, hey, one day we don't need you anymore. And several of the WASP offered, hey, we'll do this for nothing. We'll continue with no salary. We want to do this to help our country. Everybody wanted to help to win the war, whether you were doing gardens or working in a factory or whatever you were doing. It was an all-out war effort. So to have the rug pulled out from under them and say, hey, we don't need you anymore, it was disappointing. One of the friends, the WASP that I knew, was out in California. She had to try to hitchhike back to Pennsylvania to get a ride home. So it was, they didn't treat them like I think they should have been treated, personally.
As it looked like the war was winding down, before the nuclear bombs were dropped in Japan, the War Industries Board, the federal government, that kind of coalition of folks who made this happen, understood that when the GIs came back, they would need to get their jobs back.
Our boys have taken up where they left off, and our women are once more free to follow their peaceful pursuits, with just a few interruptions.
And nobody wanted the kind of labor uprising that could potentially take place if thousands and thousands of men came back from the war and could not find work because women had those jobs. And so there was a plan to kind of slowly transform women's expectations. So women were let go, they were demoted, they were shut out of upward mobility in the jobs that they had. And the message was sent pretty hard that this is temporary.
When they came out, even though they were pilots, none of the airlines would let them fly because they were women. They said, absolutely not. You can be a stewardess if you'd like, but we do not have women pilots. I was always proud of her, but it was a different time when I was a kid. Women were still really not part of the workforce. It was something that we knew about as children, but we didn't talk about a lot because it was something that was kind of looked down upon, that for women that stepped out of the classic role of what a woman was, you know, being home, making dinner, you know, taking care of the kids. And my mom always worked. And so we had kind of a different life. My dad, I don't know that my dad was super supportive of my mom's role as a WASP. And that may be why we didn't talk about it a whole lot. But I was always enamored by it as a child and excited about it.
I think it really started when they got that Congressional Gold Medal in 2010. I know she had already passed, so she wasn't able to see the recognition that they got.
They should be allowed to be buried in Arlington Cemetery, and it's a fight to get them in. We're still trying to get permission to put my mom's ashes there. When they went through and cleaned up, I guess is how they put it, some of the history, they've scrapped a lot of things about the WASPs and women that were involved. Just within this year, when Trump went through and cleaned up historical information on the government websites. I don't think they liked it, but they were very strong women.
And, you know, that's just the way it was back then.
We are Yankee Doodle pilots, Yankee Doodle do or die. Real life nieces of our Uncle Sam, born with a yearning to fly. Keep in step to all our classes, march to flatline with our pals. Yankee Doodle came to Texas just to fly the PTs. We are the Yankee Doodle guys.